right, and welcome or welcome back, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all here. I'm very, very happy to have Ben with us. Ben, hello, Ben, again.
Hi, how are you, sir?
I am doing well. I'm very curious about what we're going to cover today. And in fact, I need to introduce you a little bit, at least, to give a bit of a setting or context about who you are and what we're going to talk about. Now, of course, we all live in the world of design systems, and we're wondering about what do we do to make better design systems, to keep them maintainable, to make them work, to have designers and developers follow design guidelines? We have created these wonderful artifacts, and some people just go ahead and take the courage not to use it ever. That's not okay. And I'm really, really happy to have Ben. Ben is actually coming from the computer science and engineering background, but also from the music background, which we can speak about in a moment, because he likes to play music as well. These days, he's a design system researcher, consultant, the creative mind behind Sparkbox, also a wonderful company that also publishes the state of design systems every year. And we could maybe speak about it for a very brief moment as
Absolutely.
well.
Yeah.
And he's always in the exploration mode. You can never meet him just sitting still, because Ben does not believe in sitting still. Well, maybe every now and again. He lives in Dayton, Ohio, loves cooking, poetry, travel, photography, coffee. Well, that's a separate conversation we're going to have, and has two pretty swell kiddos. So, Ben, design systems. I think
Yes, sir.
it's kind of interesting for us to kind of explore it from the perspective of where we are now. So I know that I've always been kind of religiously almost following State of Design Systems report coming from your end, and I'm wondering, where are we evolving? So maybe before we dive into some of the things that we wanted to discuss, right? What do you think are we at this point? Now we've been doing this design system thing for what, 8, 10 years now?
Yeah.
We should be really good at it, like really, really, really good at it. Are we, Ben?
It's interesting. I was very privileged to be one of the judges on the Design System Awards that Zero Height just released, and they're having their ceremony for the winners soon. And the opportunity there was really to kind of review so many incredible efforts by so many great teams that have submitted. And so I think the answer is probably twofold. On one side, there are teams that are well funded, that are very large, that are cross discipline, that are working really hard to serve their organizations well, and in a lot of cases, I think they're succeeding in some ways. And there are teams, and often, like many of the people that I interact with on a daily basis, are much smaller teams. They're one person, they're three people, perhaps half of three people. And they're reading these articles from these large organizations with 20 to 40 people, and I think they're looking at this, trying hard to figure out, with the small limited amount of time that I actually have to dedicate to this, what can I actually put into practice? And that's a struggle. And so I'm thinking a lot these days about how do we support folks who are, a design system team of one, or 0.75 or something, because I think there's a lot of organizations that understand this could be something that's helpful, but until they start to see really practical metrics of success, they're not willing to invest in it. So that's where I feel like we are. It's in some ways, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, is kind of how it feels.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering also at this point is, maybe just before I ask the question, dear friends who are joining us, of course, we are welcoming your questions and your problems and your issues and challenges that you might be experiencing. So if you feel like it, feel free to raise your hand, or just unmute your microphone. There are not that many people here, or write in the chat, of course, as well, and we'll bring you up, or we'll bring your question up in the conversation, just as you wish, because I think, well, all of us in some way or the other are working on a design system. The question that I did have, though, Ben, is, it kind of almost feels like sometimes, building up on the question, that the answer that you've given, is that sometimes I feel like design teams start working on something like a minimum viable design system, like MVDS, if you like,
Yeah.
where the idea is, well, in some organizations, it seems like a big commitment, because it is a commitment. It's not like you just do it like one off and then you call it a day, right? But I also feel like many companies are well, they feel that this is the only recipe or medicine that they could get in order to boost the experience, to boost the workflow, to boost the productivity and everything. And I guess the question is, and this is maybe kind of a hunch that I have at least, that very often a design system fails because of the culture, or because of the way of working, or because of just the way of people not listening to each other, not communicating, not collaborating, right?
Yeah.
Where do you think we are there? And I mean, it's kind of, yeah, this is kind of like often a reason, but if you wanted to fix that, it's changing a culture. It takes like could take years and years
Yeah,
and years. So I'm
that's right.
wondering, in general, if you wanted to make a change and you wanted to establish something that's working long term, how would you actually do this in 2023? Is it
Yeah.
even
Yeah, I mean, I think that you hinted at this. The most important component in your design system is actually time. It's not your header or your navigation or your buttons or whatever, right? It's time. Because systems don't show value in short amounts of time. And because of course the effort to get them rolled out and integrated into product team workflows and products that are actually being used, that takes time. And so we look to 9 to 18 months to start to actually see real value, right? So now if you go to your leadership and you say, I need 6 months to build a system, well, that's not even enough time for you to have shown any value, right? So by the end of that work, you're not going to have much to show other than a bunch of stuff that nobody's using yet. So I think that the time becomes like this thing, and it has to be part of the conversation from the very beginning. The other side of this, I think, is that, and I wrote this somewhere, I don't even remember, but I'll just read to you this little sentiment that I think is a sort of a boiling down of something that I think is kind of what we're trying to get at here, which is that design systems distill and magnify healthy practices and patterns while exposing and challenging unhealthy ones. The amount of resistance felt by a healthy design system team is directly related to the unhealthiness of the organization's established ways of working. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that when you're doing this work across different disciplines, across different brands, across different products inside of an organization, you are essentially the one piece that is across all of those silos, right? And so anything that's resistance that you're feeling is usually what's happening is you're exposing unhealthy behaviors inside the org. So that's hard for a couple reasons. One, of course, because these behaviors are not collaborative, they're not healthy for the org. But two, because you're doing that, you're actually, somebody is going to feel defensive by you
yeah,
exposing the
or
unhealth, right?
pressured, right? To
Yeah, or pressured.
change, to yeah.
Yeah. So the work here actually, it's funny. You asked earlier about the state of systems. I'm like over the moon excited about the tooling that's happening in our space. There, like if you just look at some of the stuff that's happening in tools like Figma, things like Zero Height and Supernova and Knapsack and Luro and all of these incredible tools that are enabling us to sort of create a place where everything lives and everything is brought together, right? This is it's a good time for tooling in our space. And that's awesome because that means that we as practitioners can stop focusing so much on the little technical problems that we've been trying to solve for the last 8 years. And instead we can turn our attention to the hard work, right? Which is the organization side, the culture, the people, the process. And that's actually where things get hung up.
Yeah. It's also interesting that one thing that you've said in a bit earlier was kind of struck with me because I think that you mentioned once that you strongly believe, and this might come across as being a bit controversial, that we're spending a bit too much time working on components, and that the thing that matters most in design systems is the interactions between the components and not the components themselves.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering,
Yeah.
like, I mean, think about it. We spend so much time designing the perfect experience for the button and for the data tables and data grids and accordions and the carousels and everything. And you come across saying that doesn't matter as nearly as much as the connection between all the components. Please
Yeah.
explain yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the setup there. I that came I mean, I think a lot of folks recognize this, but so there's a couple things that have led me down that path. One is this is a direct connection between some reading I've been doing in some older sort of systems thinking stuff. So Russell Eckhoff is a guy who has written a lot about systems thinking, and one of the analogies that he uses is an automobile. And I love his little analogy because he says, if I were to go around and find the very best, test every vehicle out there and find the very best motor for a car, and take it out, say it's a, he uses, I think, a Rolls Royce. So I get the engine from a Rolls Royce and I bring it into the room and I set it here. Then I'm like, well, who has the best brakes? I'm going to go search, and maybe it's Porsche has the best braking system. So I bring that braking system into the room. And I do this with every piece and part of a vehicle. At the end of the day, I have everything that I need in that room to make a car, but I actually don't have a car, right? And in fact, if I were to try to connect all those things, they simply would not work, right? That engine in and of itself doesn't allow me to get from point A to point B, even though it is the best engine for cars in the world. And I actually think that analogy holds true to our work as systems people, right? If I spend all of my time in a vacuum building the most amazing button, that button doesn't necessarily work well with the other pieces and parts in my product. And so what this means in my mind is, if I translate this, is that there's a difference between those of us who are focused on product design and those of us who are focused on systems design. And that's a spectrum of skills that I think we need to recognize. And I think a lot of organizations see this now. And I've been doing some analysis on job descriptions and just looking to see, like, what are organizations asking of their product design positions, and are they and designers who are intended to work on design systems, what's the difference in those? And I'm starting to see those things bubble up, that there are distinct differences in those roles. And I'm not saying that you can't do both, right? I think part of the skill set of working in today's organizations is being able to move yourself on that spectrum, depending on the tasks that you have before you for a given season. But I think it is important to recognize those differences. And so what that means is someone who's more on the product design side is going to focus on solving the problems of those parts really well, right? I'm a product designer. I am going to think about that one experience and I'm going to make it the best I can. The systems designer is thinking about the organization's offering as a whole, right? We're looking at every interaction and we're trying to create cohesion across all of those. And what we have to do is recognize that there's a give and take there. So the absolute best design of a button in the world might not be the best fit for your product, right?
Right.
And so, because what's more important is the cohesion, right? So I think it comes down to, what does the organization value most? And if what they really truly value is the experience of the end user, then they're going to lean towards the systems thinking, because this gives you familiarity across experiences in your product line that I think is really desirable. So that's kind of where
Okay.
my head's been. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Just before I kind of build on top of that, I want to remind everyone that, of course, we'd like to welcome all your questions or anything that you maybe you have a story to tell, maybe you have a particular question to ask. That's perfectly fine. To just go on mic and tell us. And I want also to give you an opportunity and time to do just that. Anybody?
Don't be shy.
No? If not, that's okay. That's okay. Please, you can think about that, and maybe this will come up, right? But I think it's one thing I did want to build up upon what you were saying, Ben, is that a little bit earlier around the cultures, and I think that what we've been discussing, I think that this kind of brings up a question. So if you imagine yourself being in a company that seems to have slightly suboptimal, I will put it this way, ways of working, maybe a lot of legacy, maybe a lot of internal politics, maybe a lot of conversations between, between the whole, like in between conversations and halls, things like that. Collaboration, communication, a little bit struggling. Do you think it's almost impossible for them to have a design system that works? Will it be a design system that will be kind of more or less up to date, but not necessarily, and then not heavily used? Or in other words, if I put it differently, what do you think is absolutely required as a minimum for a design system to succeed in an organization like that?
Yeah, I might actually challenge the question a little bit, right? The goal. So I love systems. I love design systems. So I am definitely an advocate for that. But my goal working with a customer is actually not necessarily to help them build the best design system. What I'm thinking about is what is it that you like? Why is it that you want a system? Like, what are the outcomes that you want? So there's two that always kind of rise to the surface. There's a bunch of benefits of a system. Two that always come up are more cohesive experiences, right? I want consistency across the interface. And then efficiency. I want to be able to reuse things and make all of the disciplines in my product process more efficient in what they do. And I think those are admirable things. But I would say that before systems ever existed, there were spectrums of organizations that were very efficient and some that were very inefficient. There were spectrums of products that were very cohesive and very incohesive. And so what I'm trying to get at is that a design system is not necessary for you to have efficiency and cohesion in your organization. I think it's a tremendous way for you to get there. And I think it creates the right incentives. It can, if it's done well, I think it can create some unity inside the organization that I think is also a really helpful piece and part. But I don't think it's the only way to do it. I don't think it's a necessary component. So I think it's one of the ways that is codified. You know, like we've been doing this for 8 or 10 years. There are some paths that we've seen work, and so it's a way to get to a benefit that we really want, right? So in general, I think what I'm getting at is like the problems that we're trying to solve are actually cultural problems, you know, and I got at this in sort of some of the research I've been doing around culture, where the sort of challenging concept is that your system itself is not actually going to create more cohesive products, right? Like if you're building a system and that's the only thing that you hope, that's never going to work. And the reason is because the culture of the organization has to value cohesive products for the people to actually build those. You know, I could take any design system you have and build something terrible with it. And so where does that leave us, right? What that means is our work as systems people is to actually change the motivations of our product people, our product teams. And that's culture work. That's not Figma, and that's not React and all that stuff, you know? So that's where it's like the cohesive culture is the organization, is the culture that creates cohesive experiences. You know, if we value cohesion, that will be something we create by default.
Yeah. Right. I think also earlier on you brought up the idea of kind of looking into how to explain the value or kind of show the value, that it takes a couple of, well, at least like 8, 9 months until you actually get to the value of a design system in place, right?
Yeah.
And that also brings up a conversation to me, which I've been asked like a question that I've been asked too many times, I think, over the last couple of months. And that would be ROI of a design system, or better, how do we measure the success of our design system?
Yeah.
And I know there are different approaches to that. Many different people measure very different things. I'm wondering, what's your take on this? Can we measure the success or
Yeah.
the failure, I would say, of a design system?
Yeah. I have maybe a controversial view on this. I know a lot of people over the last year or two have been saying we need to stop worrying so much about measuring adoption. You know, that's not why we don't build a system only so that it is adopted, right? And it's similar to what we were just saying. We build it to achieve the outcomes that we want, right? The efficiency, the cohesion, the spreading of accessibility or sustainable code or whatever it is that we want, you know. Instead, I actually think that it's not possible for you as a design system person to stay on top of measuring those metrics for every potential consumer or subscriber of your design system, right? Like that's just not realistic. You can't possibly measure that for all of those teams that are using the system. So what I think is that it's their job, it's the subscriber or consumer team's job to measure their own success, right? And what we should be saying is like, what I hope to accomplish is to show that there's a correlation between increasing adoption and an increase in the success of the teams using it. So if we can do that, then it becomes one factor among other things that is influencing the kinds of positive metrics we want in the org, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we're looking to do is to say, what for each subscriber, for each user of your system, what is it that how do they measure their success? And so if we can do that, now we have a metric to track, right? We know what's important to the users of the system. And now what we want to do is shape the system so that it actually enables them to be successful. And then as they increase their adoption of the system, we should see that metric of success increase for them. And that is my formula for how to measure the success of a system, is enabling teams to meet their goals.
That's right. It's kind of interesting for me to hear that, because it kind of really resonates very much with what I've been kind of reading lately. Like, for example, Dan Moll has published a nice little write-up a while back on LinkedIn, I think it did. He published it, and he said that he was looking for the perfect or better metric to measure the success of a design system for a while. And if we follow along, let's say the Pinterest relative adoption metric has become quite famous, where the idea is, well, for a given release cycle of, I don't know, 6 weeks or so, or 6 months, let's track how many components from the mock-ups that were shipped to the product in production over the last 6 months, how many of them are coming from the design system, and you get to this notion of relative adoption metric, right? But you need to measure it and kind of all those things, right? And then what he was saying is that basically the simpler kind of heuristic, in a way, or indicator if a design system is actually being used or not, it's just how early conversation about the design system comes up whenever we need to design a new flow, a new feature, a new product line, or whatever, right? Just the timing. Like, if the design system is a part of the conversation early on, that means that this is working. Do we need to measure like the actual like component usage? Right? Some designers are opinionated, they do not trust, and the components that we have, the detached instances, and then they do all the weird things to iterate and explore, and I don't know, and then they maybe bring it all together, right? So there may be different ways of how they could be bending the design system for their needs. And so I guess the question that I have here is, do you think that we actually need to measure? I mean, this is probably something that you've been kind of saying as well, that we need to measure it to the point where we say, okay, this is our relative adoption for November 2023. This is where we are, and that we actually report it. From what I've been hearing, like understanding from you, is like you actually go to consumers of a system and you ask them to just see if it does the job, if it works well for whatever it is that they need to do, right?
Yeah, I love I love the idea behind Dan's statement there. It's like, how early in the process are we considering the system? I think that's great. What I think that is maybe missing is that different design systems are shaped so differently, right? So as a design system lead, it's your job to determine what are the assets you offer your consumers, your subscribers, to do their work. And so for certain disciplines, those are very different things. The classic would be, for my product designers, I'm going to give them a bunch of Figma components to use. Now they can construct interfaces. Okay. But for a development team, it's a very different thing. It might be a set of Vue components or React or whatever whatever they need. But I like to broaden this out, right? Like, what do my UX folks need? What does my QA team need? What does my product owner need? What do my content folks need? Like, you could offer assets from your system to any discipline that's involved in product work. And I think that we should be broadening that out. But the thing I think that is missed, or maybe assumed, by that idea that Dan kind of put forth, is that your system provides assets for every discipline throughout the entire spectrum, right? If that's the case, then yeah, the sooner we talk about it, and everybody's following along in that process, then the more it's going to be used. But if you only offer assets for UX folks and not for your engineers, well, then that doesn't mean that it's adopted at a level that it should be. You know what I'm saying?
That's right.
So
Absolutely.
so I think for me, it's more about like recognizing it's broadening out our perspective of the kinds of things that we can offer as a system, and that only expands the value we're offering the org. of course, the challenge with that, so this is the other side of this coin, is maintaining, parity between these assets, right? The conceptual idea of a button, if that has to exist, as an asset for my UX research folks to use in prototyping, if it has to exist as an asset in Figma for my product designers to use, if it has to exist as an asset in React and in Angular for two different product teams to use and engineering teams to use, now I have to maintain synchronization between that conceptual asset across all these different conceptual button across all these different assets, so that can
Yeah.
be a challenging effort.
Right. Another challenging effort is the one that Amy has brought up in the chat just now, which I think is something that, it would just really useful to get an insight on that. Amy is writing, I'm on a small and new design system team trying to build a design system from scratch for an enterprise software with a lot of legacy and tons of very complex patterns. One challenge we have is trying to get information out of people's heads and create effective documentation. Documentation has more of a challenge than the design itself. Well, any thoughts on you from your end, Ben? I think documentation is always kind of almost the crux of it
Yeah.
all.
Yeah, absolutely. That is, Amy, thank you for asking. That's such a very articulate question. And I think it's actually getting at, like, your last statement, documentation is more of a challenge than the design itself. I think that's true in a lot of ways. And I was actually just writing about this, how I think we spend so much time documenting the like breaking a component down into its tiniest pieces and parts and giving those things names and identifying all of the little, every little piece and part, and trying to write really robust documentation. And I think there's a lot of value in that because it gives us a language with which to discuss the problem set, and I think that's a level of efficiency that's actually hard to find in a lot of organizations. We simply don't have the language to talk about the problems we're trying to solve. So for that, I love that kind of documentation. But I think the documentation that's missing, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because you specifically say, Amy, that there's a lot of legacy and a lot of very complex patterns. And very complex patterns are, in my mind, where the kind of documentation you need is defining the interactions between the components, right? That's what I was kind of hinting at earlier, Vitaly, when you mentioned that the components are less important than the way they interact with each other, and so that's where I would shift your thinking around the documentation to think about how these things work together inside of a larger pattern, right? That's the documentation that you really need. The right folks to document that is like a good combination between your UX folks who are thinking about the flow and your engineers who have to actually make things connect, And so, if you can find a couple folks like that, maybe one of each, and get them into a space, maybe this is a time for, you've got a hack day or something. I don't know if that's a thing that your organization does, but getting a little bit of time with those two folks together in the same space to actually work on creating a good model for how a pattern like that, a complex pattern, can be well documented in the quickest way possible, might be a really good sort of content guideline for future complex patterns to be documented. I don't know if that helps, but
yeah, absolutely. I think it's also just I don't know, for me, I remember vividly when we started having these conversations about style guides, UI component libraries, and then design systems. It all felt like it's still manageable. And then I stumbled just last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, upon this article by Brett Frost in his blog where he was speaking about the design system ecosystem, right? And oh my, this is just so messy and complicated and intricate, and so many things that are kind of moving together and different sides of it, and just makes things I don't know. It seems like I don't remember seeing design system architect as open position 5, 7 years ago. Now it's all over.
yeah.
Like you actually need a design system architect for complex interaction systems like that when you have a lot of enterprise and so on. I also know, Ben, that you recently started working on something like this kind of collaborative learning experience, which was called the
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
And I want you to kind of introduce it and tell us what it's like and why.
Yeah, and I see a couple folks who have participated. Hi, Ellie. um, yeah, so this was an idea that I've had for a long time, but not executed. And I had a little time over a weekend, and I decided, you know what, I'm tired of waiting on these kinds of things. I just want to put it out there. So one of the things I think that's happening in the space is there's a lot of momentum, and there are moments that I feel throughout a week where I'm like, "Ah, I wish I knew this about systems. I wish I could just quickly ask a bunch of people, you know." And sometimes Twitter's good for that, or LinkedIn, or other networks like that. But I thought, how cool would it be if I could start to build like a small community of folks who are really passionate about systems. They're working hard on those in their own organizations. And if I had the sort of rhythm established where on a Monday in the morning I send them a question, they have 48 hours to answer. So by Wednesday, I close that question. I analyze the data overnight, and I invite somebody as a co-host to come and look at that data with me. And on Thursday, anybody who answers, we all get together and we do a deep dive discussion on a very, very specific topic. And it's really been insightful. And so we've done 3 of those. We have another one happening this week. So that question is actually open. Actually, I'll throw the link to the
Yes,
question
please.
here,
That would be
so
nice.
people can answer. Yeah. Um, and so we've covered 3 different topics so far. The first was on the difference. Well, actually, I talked a little bit about this, the difference between a product designer role and a system designer role. The second one was whether we should start systems by focusing on from the inside out. So thinking about foundations and brand first, and then slowly layering on complexity until we reach components and patterns. Or
Right.
should we start outside in? We'll start with a larger experience and then deconstruct that into its base components, its base foundational pieces. And then the third was on the makeup of design system teams and sort of what's missing in
Mm,
teams these days.
interesting.
So
Are those things also
yeah,
recorded, or is it, how does it work?
they're recorded, and I am holding them for now. I'm going to edit a bunch and sort of release them in the next, probably in Q1 next year. I'll release the
Okay.
first series. Yeah.
Oh,
But I'm
that's
writing each one up. I write it up on my site, bencallahan.com. There's a little writing section, and you can read the wrap ups from each of those. And then I'll go ahead and post the question for this week. And if all you have to do is answer, it's very, very simple. It takes 2 or 3 minutes of your time. And then you'll get an invite right at the end of answering. That the thank you page has a place to go register for the call, which will be this Thursday. So
nice, very nice. Well, you are a mysterious man, Ben, that I know for sure, but also that shows up in many other ways as well. Because just before we jumped on air here, you mentioned that you are very much opposed to the idea of reading one book at a time. You
oh
read
yeah.
8 books at a time. How does that
Yeah.
work? And
Yeah.
why on earth would you do that? Would you
Yeah. I
also
think
recommend it?
yeah, so I don't know if I would recommend it. I think it depends on the person. I've learned about myself that I'm not good at actually reading a single book from start to finish. I don't know if I get bored or what, but I think I'm somebody and maybe this comes back to why I love systems. I'm somebody who likes to find the connections between things. And so my process right now for most of this year has been, I've got a stack of books and I add things to it all the time and I take things away all the time. It's less important to me to read all of these books than it is to read a little bit of each one each day. And what I do then is I'll read maybe even sometimes as small as like a couple paragraphs or a couple pages each day from each book. And then I look for interesting connections. So what this does for me is it's bringing different concepts into my mind all at the same time. I kind of get in the mode of thinking about, I don't know, I'm reading a Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, which is phenomenal, by the way. So I'm reading that. I'm reading some, the Tao Te Ching. I've got general systems theory here. I mean, I just have a bunch of different things, and there's architecture books. There's, more sort of theoretical religious books. It's all just like interesting stuff, and these are just areas of my life that I want to grow in. But what's
Mm.
cool is that there's connections. There's always a connection. You just have to be somebody who is willing to sort of like find it. And so it for me is like exposed all kinds of interesting things that I never would have thought about, by connecting these seemingly unrelatable pieces. And I love that about it. And it's something I actually enjoy about your events too, because you organize events that like sort of challenge the way that I think about the work sometimes, and you're bringing unique voices to the conversation. It's like a diversity of thought that I think I
Yeah.
really value. So
Oh, that's very nice of you to say. I mean, in general, it's also kind of I don't know. I feel like very often I'm being torn between all the different topics to explore and all the different
Mm.
ideas, and it seems like maybe that's just me, or maybe everybody here in the room can confirm or not. Designers are becoming more and more opinionated these days.
Mm.
Or designers have strong opinions, and the further it goes, the more stronger those opinions are. And I'm not talking about the selection of a tool. Like that's not even
Mm.
that. It's like sometimes no. We are going to use a chevron here. That's the way we run. This is the way we roll. Like really, like this is very strong opinion. Doesn't matter if it's like a plus or a chevron or whatever. No, we are going to go for a chevron. Like okay, well, didn't see that this could be that opinionated, I guess, at this point. But it's kind of interesting for me to see that we getting to the point where I think many of us, at least, feels like it, are becoming more and more opinionated. Yet at the same time, what I think that we kind of, I don't know, have these very strong opinions about everything. Like probably AI is a good example, right? There are people who desperately hate AI. There are people who desperately love AI. People who desperately fear AI. But people who, well, nobody is kind of neutral when it comes to AI. So nobody's like Switzerland for AI. Everybody has an opinion on that. I'm wondering though, like if you actually apply it to design systems in a way, have you seen teams successfully doing something AI magical
Mm.
with design systems, or or how do we even apply AI to design system?
Yeah, I saw just the other day a tweet from, I can't remember who, I'll have to look it up and share it, but it was on somebody who had basically fed in the gov.uk design system into an AI of some kind, and they were able to say, "Hey, make me a page that does this using the system," and it was spitting out little, you know, fairly simple, but you can tell like this was not much effort that this person had put in to be able to do this with it. So I love the idea of using AI for what it's really good at in scenarios like that. So he could say, do make me a page that asks to verify the user's name, and it goes and looks through the pieces and parts available in that system and generates a quick page for them. So I think that kind of thing is cool. I actually am pretty nervous to see people writing their docs with AI, because I
Yeah,
think
that's what I wanted to bring up.
yeah, I don't know. I mean, I actually, when I studied computer science, I had to choose a specialization, and the specialization that I chose was artificial intelligence. Now, this was, late 90s, mid 90s when I was studying it, but so I have a fairly good grasp of the basic concepts, and I'm actually someone who's fascinated by that kind of thing. I love to read about it. I'm experimenting with a lot of things, but I actually think there are things where I really want your opinion as a human on why we are doing a thing, and so that's what I think docs really give. The guidelines are, it's beyond just regurgitating what has already been said about things out in the world. It's you thinking through a very specific use case and your reasons why. And so I that makes me a little bit nervous, but things like what Amy is saying in the chat, I think, are a brilliant use. Like, create my tokens for me. Like, I mean, that's perfect. Machines are really good at that.
Yeah, we shouldn't be
So
doing that. Yeah, that's
yeah, right.
yeah,
So I think there are definite use cases for sure, and they're
yeah.
only going to expand.
Yeah, also a very good point by Wick in terms of AI suggestions for nomenclature or naming conventions of components, suggested hierarchy for styles.
Mm.
Yeah, that's also interesting. I mean, I've seen some experiments like on very, very different levels. Sometimes it would be like just query these design systems that I like, right? And gather the documentation around best practices and guidelines and things like that, which would be kind of supposed to be universal best practices and so on. And
Mm.
then try to make something out of that. That's one thing. The other thing that some teams are trying, and that's interesting, I think there was maybe 5 years ago, there was this experiment by Airbnb where they said, okay, let's just use image recognition. So a designer comes along and says, well, this is the rectangle, and this is my, like, let's say my mobile device. And I'm going to just sketch with the pen a couple of components here, like accordion and stuff like that, put it in front of the camera, recognize, and then whoosh, whoosh you go, and you have your React components.
Yeah.
Do you think that, like, everybody's trying something, everybody's experimenting, I guess. I never heard actually more of that story of if it is actually being used in Airbnb or not, and probably we will not find out. I'm
Yeah.
curious. But
I don't know.
do you think that this would be kind of an interesting way to explore, or is it, I don't know, a ridiculous way of designing? Imagine you don't even have to use Figma because you're getting components right out of your sketches on your napkin.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's like, I think there's probably there's a way that could be valuable. You know, I'm a fan of low fidelity still. You know, I still think there's a lot of value in testing things without design before you design them, you know, like UI design them.
Yeah.
And so I think that you could easily adjust, you know, that kind of approach to working in that fashion. I don't know. You know, I've read a bunch of stuff around, like, you know, the threat of AI to, you know, like to humanity and stuff, you know, and all the stuff happening with you know, OpenAI and all that, with, you know, the board and all this is still, it sort of plays into this too. You know, I'm not someone who's like a conspiracy theorist where I'm like worried that there is
Yeah.
some secret,
Yeah,
you know,
I
conscious
think
AI already.
at this point I should be mentioning and making it very clear to everyone that Ben is a very friendly person, a very, very friendly person. So I would not believe for a second that Ben is in some way involved in conspiracy theories.
Oh, I think that there's incredible stuff coming there. I'm somebody who has a positive outlook on it. You know, like, I want, I believe that we're going to find ways to sort of incorporate these incredible, you know, exponential increases in intelligence and productivity into our lives. That's what I want, you know,
Mm,
to make the world better for everybody. You know, that's
yeah,
kind of what I hope, but I'm an
yeah.
optimist. So,
Well, that's always good. So also just to maybe look back or go back to where we started today, also kind of exploring. Um, I'm just curious in general, like if you, again, if we look back and we think about, okay, we've been doing it now for 8, 10 years, wondering what do you think are some of the common misconceptions that many teams still have, or many, not misconceptions even, but some sort of common, mm, I don't know. I'm always a bit worried about saying things like mistakes, but things that probably are red flags maybe. So if you're
yeah.
working on a design system and you realize that something is fishy and we probably need to fix that now before it deteriorates and becomes useless over time.
Almost always, if I smell something fishy, as you said, when I start to look at the history of how the system was built or created, what I discover is there was a heavy focus on the evolution of the system. So we built a bunch of stuff, we designed a bunch of things, but there was a lack of effort put on the education and engagement side of that system. In other words, like, I haven't actually done the work to educate my organization about why we're doing this and what it actually is and all the things that it can offer them. And I haven't done the work to engage with my organization. In other words, like a product team needs to do user research, they need to go talk to their users. You, as a systems person, need to go talk to your subscribers, right? That's the engagement part of systems work, and that's 2/3 of the work. Education and engagement is 2/3 of the work, and we don't even scratch the surface on the amount of
Hmm.
effort I think that's needed there. The other thing I think I see a lot of is that there's not enough, and this actually connects to that, but there's not enough value placed on subscriber support. In other words, we're building a product or a program or in a system, and we're asking people to use it and to trust us to use it. And when they struggle, we have to be so on it with support, or we lose them as users. We break the trust that they've given by them using the thing. And so I'm looking for teams to start to do more than just say, oh, everybody will take a turn answering questions on Slack or whatever, like it's way bigger than that. We build a product and we have entire organizations built around customer support. That's a skill set, and that's something that I think we need to translate to our systems teams too. And I'm looking for great examples of that, but I think it's something that we're going to have to do if we want to see the system mature beyond stages 2 and 3 into those like really high end, very proactive systems. We have to solve that problem.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that building again on top of that. I mean, we can always just climb up and up and up. I think it's very interesting because I think now about the roles and who is actually needed. Because of course, when we think about design systems, we think about designers who need to be on board because they're going to be the design system. I'm now working with a big organization, and one of the things that we introduced, and that was incredibly successful. I mean, incredibly successful. They have a big search. It's like a big public service, big public organization. They have a huge search. And of course, we have engineers who are managing search. They update the search engine. They track, how much time people spend on it and so on and so on. I don't even know if there is this role that exists out there. We kind of hired a search UX person who is really just not even search UX. I would say a person who has background in data science, but also a little bit in design. It's kind of really this nice interaction. So that's like a search specialist, if you like, who is really just focused on search, like doing nothing but search because it's really heavily important feature in organization. And it's really rare to find something like that advertised. It's just UX designer, or it's just sort of SEO specialist, maybe, or things like that. And I'm wondering, like, this was really interesting because at this point, it really helped to boost search. People started talking about search. They started doing some research around search, and which was not the case in the past. Because if you just upgrade a search engine, you're probably not going to get better results. You need to do way more than that, especially around metadata, information architecture, and so on, right? And I'm wondering, do you think that there are certain roles that are maybe missing in the design system space that would be helpful to not just to kind of maintain and evolve a design system, but also to really establish it within kind of even outside of the scope of the design systems team and perhaps also the direct consumers of it. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think there are, the two that, so in the most recent question, so not this past week, but the week before, we asked about what roles are missing from your design system team. And the number one was developer. So, this is the idea that like, we just don't have enough engineering resources to actually get things built and to maintain them, so there's a recognition of the volume of work maybe there. The next one was around the next two were sort of like project and product management. So owning the roadmap and thinking through like, how do we actually make something
timelines
people,
and everything.
yeah, how do we make something people want to use? That's the job of that role. The next one was content. And I think that people are finally understanding like this goes so much beyond just design and development. And so that's what I'm excited about, is like expanding into other areas. And so I think support, content, design ops, DevOps, those roles, of course, kind of come in. I've talked to a lot of teams who are looking for someone to own the organization of Figma inside of their company. Like I just want somebody who comes in and just like really knows Figma, knows how to do branching and versioning and all the variants and variables, and knows when to use what, because there's a lot of functionality there that's been released very quickly. And I think a lot of teams are struggling to understand, should I migrate to this new thing? Should I wait until variables are supported in other areas? Or, so there's lots of stuff there. Technical architecture, even just in general, like strategy and like leadership for the systems team, QA, like I mean, community outreach. I mean, this like education, like evangelism type roles, I think that's huge. I think that's like a third of the work, and we just.
But yeah, I'm just curious at this point. So of all these roles, which ones do you think are most important? Would you say that the last one, community outreach or documentation, or kind of spreading the word about what the system is and how it works, would be the most impactful if you happen to be an organization where resources are limited and they feel like it's not quite working well.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that those things aren't actually getting done, right? So
Okay.
most design system teams, what's happening is they when they first start, they've got a defined effort. Like they've done the work to sort of understand, here's the things we feel like we need to release to be viable. And so they're focused, they're sort of like heads down getting work done. But once that happens and they're in iteration mode, then it's like everything goes crazy because they have all these teams they're trying to get to use it. Those teams start using it. They start doing things they weren't intended to, they did never intend it to do. They get all these requests coming in for features, for bugs, and they're also supposed to be doing more work on the roadmap, right? And if the team at that point doesn't get renewed investment to actually expand, those teams will struggle forever. And that small team that was able to get a release out will drown in requests, just bug requests, and what's happening is they're trying to do all of those things that we just walked through, so I like the idea that we share some of those responsibilities, but I just think we need more people on those teams to do them. If I had to choose a role, it's probably a combination of like outreach, education and support, taking really good care of the folks who are already subscribers. So that's probably the role I think is most missing.
Okay. Well, just before I could just keep going with questions, but I would love to hear some things from you, or maybe some questions from your end. I mean, at this point, I think the reason why we're doing this kind of things is that you can actually ask any questions or share any stories, and perhaps get some insight or some ideas or thoughts from Ben as well. Anybody like to share something? I can almost hear Wick willing to say something.
When do you think the design system hype is over, Ben?
The hype, yeah, I mean, I think well, that's not probably true. Most kind of digitally native organizations have a system or someone working on a system in some capacity now. Most of the people I work with are on their second, third, fourth attempt, So in that sense, I think those organizations, they get it, they know they need it, but it's not easy, and so they're struggling. And a lot of my work right now too is just in coaching with design system leads or teams where they just are struggling because they're not quite sure what else to do. They don't know, and I just had a session this morning, and what we did, it's not intuitive. What we did, we literally just walked through the organizational chart of the company. And that is like, that's where the money is, man. I mean, it's like you want to figure out how to solve the problems, know your org chart, and then use the relationships you have in the org to get to know everybody else on that chart that you can, and then start to understand what they value and how they're measured. How do they succeed?
Absolutely.
Your system can help almost anybody in the org be more successful, but you have to do the job of telling that story, right? That's part of, like, the other side, I guess this is part of education, but you have to be a storyteller. Like, why is this important work? So
yeah, it's very interesting that you're saying that, because I think I learned exactly the same thing from a very different perspective. It is absolutely critical to ask for org chart and walk through it and kind of explore it and understand. It's kind of like stakeholder management on one hand, but also it's more about just understanding the relationships you have. And this is actually ties in not only about like design system, but also like design in general. If you want to make any impact, we need to understand how that impact flows in some way or the other. And so what we started looking is, right, well, we're working on that design project here, not necessarily a design system, but a design project. And so it is going to be decided, or it's going to be like resources are going to come from that department over here. So what is the goal? Why are they doing it? Yeah, so just one thing I want to mention, then we're done, right? As we need to wrap up for another session that's happening simultaneously. And that's namely that actually when you start realizing this relationship, you just need to understand where your design, it gets stuck because you need a commitment from the top. So it's kind of move forward. And that's probably the same for design system as well, right?
Yep.
Well, as we're nearing the end, Ben, do you have a final word of wisdom to wonderful people joining in here who want to change the world and design better design systems?
I mean, I would love to have you share your stories with me. You know, part of my job right now is just to talk to folks who are doing this work. So I'm gathering stories, I'm collecting stories. So I want to hear what's working and what's not for you, and what are you struggling with, you know? So reach out to me. My website, bencallahan.com, you can connect with me there. I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn, all that stuff. So you can find me. And also the question is so much fun. So answer, I threw it in there, go answer, and join us on Thursday.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining in. I don't think I can bring your question up, unfortunately, because we need to jump over there. But we'll stay in touch, and I hope to see you all in a later session as well. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Vitaly. Good to see
Thank
you all.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.